Good evening. The words "they couldn't run a piss-up in a boofy car" spring to mind. The model for franchising, designed by the coalition government and not just for the trains, is in disarray. 3 civil servants were suspended today over the West Coast Mainline deal, which has been scrapped at a cost of at least £40 million. And the fate of a further 2/3 of rail franchises due before the next election are in serious doubt. Is the whole tendering process flawed? Here's Joe Lynham.
The last time the West Coast Rail franchise was up for grabs, it was 1996, and we were all train spotting.
Choose washing machines, cars, compact displays and electrical tin openers.
The then Conservative government chose Virgin to operate trains on Britain's most lucrative rail franchise. Speed forward 16 years to the start of last August, and once again there's a Tory-led government pulling the levers, receiving an angry letter from a Richard in the Virgin Islands, warning that passengers would suffer if the government awarded the West Coast franchise to the First Group. 2 weeks later, the government did exactly that, much to Sir Richard's chagrin.
We just learned today that their bid, our bid was ahead of them right up to 2020, and just in the last 3 years, suddenly they've worked out that they can give the government another £2 billion. Completely unrealistic, figures for the numbers of people that they're suddenly going to magically get in those last 3 years. And even if they doubled fares, they wouldn't be able to afford it. So we are completely baffled.
2 months ago, the soon-to-be ex-Transport Secretary dismissed Virgin's objections and defended civil servants to the hilt.
It's a fair and established process. It's a very robust process. The whole point of it actually being so robust is to make sure that it's not politicised and it is handled fairly for all the bidders.
Even when the new Transport Secretary arrived, the 4th in 3 years, he too chose to support his troops.
2 companies went to huge amounts of effort to try and win that bid, and it was judged fairly by the department, and it is our intention to proceed with the bid that First have made, and I am content with the way in which the department exercised its review of that particular contract.
Today, though, Mr McLaughlin was forced to make the kind of humiliating apology for those self-same civil servants, which is rarely seen in British political and business circles.
I think what has happened is unacceptable, it's deeply regrettable, and of course I apologise. We have made a big mistake as far as the department is concerned, and the companies that have put bids in have done nothing wrong.
Now he's ordered 2 independent reviews into what went wrong, the fruits of which will be heard by the end of December. So what actually went wrong during the tendering process? When Virgin Trains were told that they were losing the franchise, they sought a judicial review. And what that did was it forced government lawyers and senior civil servants to examine in great detail exactly how the tendering process had been worked out. What they discovered was nothing short of a schoolboy error. Inflation had been completely omitted from the calculations. Over 1 year it may not be much, but over the 13-year lifetime of the franchise it could have amounted to tens of millions of pounds.
Now what?
So now the whole franchising process, which was itself overhauled when the coalition came to power, has been shunted into the sidings as 2 urgent and independent reviews into this shambles get underway. Up to now, companies wishing to run train services in Britain were required to set aside a much larger sum of money to repay the government if they could no longer afford to run the franchise, as happened on the East Coast Rail line almost 3 years ago. In this case, First Group promised to set aside almost £255 million. Virgin said it should have been 3 times that amount.
Richard, this way.
But apart from making Branson potentially richer and the First Group potentially poorer, what does today mean for the wider infrastructural issue in Britain?
This is a particularly unfortunate event for this government, who are wanting to encourage private sector provision and private sector investors, pension funds, international sovereign wealth funds, to invest in our infrastructure. And these are people who could go anywhere in the world. They could invest in any industries around the world. We want to get them here. They have to trust that there is an administration that's competent, that they can deal with, that the policy risks are reasonable, that the regulatory risks are reasonable over the period of a contract, which is quite a long time. So this doesn't help build confidence.
So with one rail line nationalised and 4 on hold, many people believe that since the franchise system began almost 20 years ago, profits have been privatised, but risk continues to be borne by taxpayers.
There's always been a key issue about whether risk was really transferred to the private sector. But the Transport Committee is in the middle of a major review of the rail system, and I think we will be looking at what options there may be. It's essential that the public do get value for money and that the taxpayer does too. But it's also the case that rail has become increasingly popular. More people use the rail, more goods travel by rail, but the cost is too high and the fares are too high. It certainly is a shambles on the West Coast Mainline, and potentially a shambles for the system. But we do need to have the results of those investigations and to question those results before we can come to firm conclusions.
So a cash-strapped government is now paying out £40 million to all 4 companies who bid for the West Coast franchise, and it could face potential lawsuits from First Group. But the real damage will be to passengers, who will have to wait longer for improvements to services, as well as to the government's reputation for competence.
Joe Lynham, well, joining me is our political editor, Allegra Stratton. Where should the finger of blame be pointed?
It's really hard to tell. Independent analysts I've spoken to say you can't really credibly place the blame at Justine Greening's door. These sums, these figures are just too complicated for the Secretary of State to comb through themselves. And then they break down the kind of culpability within the civil service. You have the 3 who've been suspended. Well, obviously they may lose their jobs. But if it turns out that the bidding process was so beyond their capability, then you start to bring in ministers, because you bring in the people who devised the system, at which point you're looking at Theresa Villiers, who's been promoted in the last reshuffle to become Northern Ireland Cabinet Secretary. So having said that, what I find interesting is you have Conservative MPs who are saying to me, Justine Greening should take the blame for this because you have the philosophy of cabinet responsibility. It was on her watch. And also that discrepancy between that first bid and then the Virgin bid was so huge, she should have asked to look at other numbers. But we have got the Times front page here because they're running a suggestion. The Times say they understand, so it's not sourced, but they're saying they understand that Greening learned of a blow to the bid in the week before the cabinet reshuffle. Now, we've been talking in the office about this evening, and my sources don't think it's credible. The other thing we should just think about is that Patrick McLaughlin, who now has her job, went to the Transport Select Committee last week and kept to her line. And why did he do that? Why was he allowed to do that?
If she knew there was a flaw.
If she knew. Yeah.
Right. What damage will this do to the whole coalition franchising policy? Because what they did was they changed existing franchise rules and made a kind of new franchise system.
It's one of the first things, when you speak to sources in government about this today, it's one of the first things they say, just get this straight, that's not going anywhere. Franchising as a philosophy is the only way we can do this. And they say, this was a state mishap, this was the government civil servants getting this wrong. The idea you go more in-house rather than out-house is mad. So they're sticking to the philosophy of it, but I think that the inquiry will probably turn up lots of bits of massive fine-tuning. But there's a problem for the government. This is the day after the Leader of the Opposition has had a lot of fun saying this is an incompetent government. Shambles, a word we've heard probably too many times in the VTs this evening. And then this happens. It's bad timing and very embarrassing.
Allegra, thank you. Well, earlier I spoke to Simon Burns, a new minister in the Department of Transport. In fact, after the reshuffle last month, they're all new ministers at the Department of Transport, bar one Liberal Democrat minister. Simon Burns, the government was warned about this 2 months ago, and it's taken to the day before court. Put your hands up. Why?
What happened was that Sir Richard Branson, after the decision was made, sought to pursue judicial review. And at that point, we obviously had to look at what had happened, the processes for the franchise. Ministers did this, and we were assured that everything had been done robustly. It had been done correctly.
So ministers looked at the figures?
No, ministers working with civil servants were assured by the civil servants who did the work that everything had been done robustly, had been done in keeping with the arrangements for the franchising, and so we took the view that there was no justification for the judicial review initially, and then, of course, as we approached a time when there was going to be a court hearing, more work was done.
The work that had been done earlier?
Well, no, work had been done prior to the announcement of the decision,
But it was flawed work. My point is
Well,
that it took lawyers to find out what people in your department should have found out.
Yes, because we did not know it was flawed, because all through the long franchise process, ministers were being advised by civil servants who were doing the work. Ministers kept seeking assurances that it was being done in the correct way, that everything was working to the right arrangements. They received those assurances, and on that basis, with the advice they were given, they then took decisions.
But we've got, you know, all the ministers bar one have been shuffled on very conveniently. But if you look at Theresa Villiers, if you look at Justine Greening, she's an accountant.
Yes.
She was saying it was robust. Does a minister not have a duty to say to the civil servants, look, OK, it's not going to be Virgin anymore, it's going to be First Group. That's a really big change. Let me see the figures, if you're an accountant.
I can assure you that everything was done. Ministers constantly were seeking assurances and information that everything was being done to the proper procedures, and those assurances were given.
So you've got a situation where the Institute of Government talks about the fact that the Department of Transport has taken 20% cuts in manpower. These are highly complex franchises. The problem is you've cut the feet from under the civil servants and now they're taking the rap.
No, I don't agree with that, because we have some very fine civil servants in the Department of Transport. They work extremely hard, and what we...
But three of them have been suspended.
They have, in the light of what has now transpired.
You've got two inquiries to look at this. You've got two inquiries. Now, if I can just give you two names here. Ed Smith and Sam Laidlaw.
Yes.
Ed Smith and Sam Laidlaw are leading inquiries. I think it's into the flawed process.
They are looking into what happened, what went wrong, and why it did.
So this is an independent inquiry, but they are non-executive directors on the Department of Transport board. Would they not have signed off on the deal?
No. It was signed off by ministers.
So wait a minute. The non-executive board, of which these two men are members, had absolutely nothing to do with the signing off or even looking at who would get the franchise.
The ultimate decision on it was taken by ministers.
One final question. The model for costing for the high-speed service, you're sure that that's been worked out without flaws, that there haven't been any civil servants edit errors in that?
What I have said is the methodology is not flawed, it's the way in which it was used.
So has it been flawed in the high-speed rail?
One second. But we have this inquiry, the Brown inquiry, to look at the whole area of franchising, what went wrong, where we can learn, and of course that will cover the whole of the rail network and implications.
So high-speed rail might be the high-speed rail, the costings for that based on that model, because of they may have had a problem with inflation and so forth, they could be wrong.
No, because the methodology was not wrong with the franchises.
In terms of the high-speed rail costs, how do you know the right figures have been put in?
Because I am confident that is the case, because it has been looked at time and time again by not simply the Department for Transport, but also HS2 itself.
Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, here to discuss all this are Tom Smith, the chairman of the Association of Train Operating Companies and veteran of several franchise negotiations, Mark Wallace from the Institute of Directors, and from the Labour Party conference in Manchester, we're joined by the Shadow Transport Secretary, Marie Eagle. Marie Eagle, first of all, you heard the Transport Minister saying that every check and balance was made by ministers. Everything that was done, could have been done, was done.
Well, I just don't think it's good enough to put the blame on civil servants. And, you know, there are matters arising now in the newspapers where there's suggestions that Justine Greening knew there was a problem with this franchise before the reshuffle. And I think we have to get the facts out there now. We need to hear from ministers who knew what when. Was the Prime Minister aware himself of these problems before he decided to remove all of the Tory ministers in the Department for Transport, or was he not? I think we need to hear from him and get to the bottom of this, as well as looking at what's technically going to be done to put this right in future.
Well, let's look at a bit of that, Tom Smith. First of all, from the point of view of the taxpayer. The taxpayer already, we know, is going to have to pony up 40 million to the 4 different companies. The government has shown itself to be less than competent. How do we know that the taxpayer is not going to have to come up with a lot more money before this is over?
Well, it's a bad error that has been uncovered today, and the Department for Transport has quickly moved to say they will look into it and find out what's gone wrong. But it's very important not to get too gloomy about it, because the reality is that franchising, in which private companies bid for the right to run services, has been very successful over the years since it was introduced. It's overseen great improvements in services, in trains, in stations, and growing numbers of passengers to record levels.
So what do you buy the Minister's point of view that it's nothing to do with the government, it's all to do with civil servants?
I think that has to come out of the review that they've conducted. I mean, it's going to take them a month. I hope they're going to look at it in great depth. Exactly how and where decisions were made and at what level must be part of what we learn from that process.
Well, just on the immediate question of what happens on December the 9th, the government can either 2P it over and run the train service itself, or Richard Branson can do it. What would be your preferred option?
Well, I'm going to try and look at this from the point of view of passengers
Yes.
who use the services, and I'm conscious that there's a large online petition in support of Virgin, and what I've heard today suggests to me that passengers would prefer to see continuity and Virgin running the services rather than an artificial change to a short-term option.
Maria Eagle, would that be your view too?
Well, I don't think it's possible, if there's going to be a refranchising of this, for the department to favour one of the potential bidders against another. They might open themselves up to even more litigation, so I think it would be sensible, and we would support this for the not-for-private profit making government-owned company that currently runs East Coast and returned last year almost £200 million to the taxpayer, to step in and run this line whilst this is sorted out.
Is this a kind of stalking horse for renationalisation if you were in charge, would it be?
Well, I think with the amount of money, at least £40 million poured down the drain over the last evening, we don't want to do something that will make it likely that even more litigation may succeed against the government, and I think it's prudent not to choose one over the other when there's potential for this process to be rerun.
Mark, what does this say for the whole franchise and procurement policy of this government?
Well, I think it certainly doesn't say that we need to renationalise the railways. I mean, the idea that the civil service make a mistake, so therefore the government should start running all of the railways is a bizarre logic. But more troublingly, it says that actually the skills in Whitehall maybe simply aren't there to negotiate and properly run these processes at the moment. And we've seen these problems not just in the Department of Transport, but also in the MOD with commissioning, in the NHS database, and really the lessons still haven't been learned from business yet.
But if you were looking to pick up an airport contract or a nuclear contract in Britain, would what happened today affect you, do you think? Or would you just think this is a blip, it's been an accounting error, they've forgot inflation, they've got the passenger numbers too high, it'll be okay?
No, I think this is undoubtedly something that's going to impact negatively on Britain's global reputation. And we already know that there's too much uncertainty on the future of airport capacity, there's too much uncertainty on the future of nuclear power stations. We need to raise this money, and this is going to deter investors.
Tom Smith.
Can I clarify something that I think Maria may have misunderstood? When I talked about what I thought should happen on the 9th of December, I meant that it should be agreement reached with Virgin for a continuation on a short-term basis until another competition is held. Clearly, there has to be a competition, but I don't think it would be helpful.
I think she was meaning that you shouldn't favour one of the potential bidders by giving them
I think
an extension.
that bid is over, so that
Right.
the franchise, the services have to continue in some way until the new competition is held.
So we're talking about a complete rebidding process for the West Coast Mainline. We're talking about delaying the next 3 franchise options. We are talking about a full examination of the system. As Mark Wallace says, it doesn't look good for British industry.
No, it's essential now that the DfT conducts its 2 reviews, that it engages with everyone who has a stake in franchising, and particularly, I would say, our members who bid for and run the franchises, and they come to some clear conclusions that restore confidence in the way the process is run.
Maria Eagle, would you be calling for a review of the franchising process overall on the railways, or
Yes,
indeed in transport generally?
Yes, I think that the flawed franchising process that this government have designed and implemented, and this was the first one they tried to tender, does need to be looked at in a wider sense than the review announced by the Transport Secretary, because we need to see what lessons can be learned for the future. We need better value for money for passengers. And I also think that ministers and the Prime Minister have got questions to answer here. The Prime Minister said when he was in opposition that ministers should that presided over systematic and serious performance failures in their department should be held to account, and that they should not seek to shuffle off responsibility. Those are direct quotes. That's what we seem to be seeing today.
But they've been
seeking to shuffle off responsibility. Well, they've been reshuffled off, but you know, the new transport ministers have also given assurances that this was a proper and robust process. I think there are many questions that the Prime Minister and ministers and previous ministers in the department need to answer, and we're not hearing those answers tonight.
In terms of looking at it from a business perspective, if this drags on, you know, what we're talking about here, Thompson was saying, is imperative that these two inquiries proceed quickly. If this drags on, if there is, for example, seem to be problems with the high-speed rail issue, then what will the damage be?
Well, the damage grows the longer this lasts, and of course through uncertainty that's the real harm to Britain's reputation here. If we're uncertain about our future, if companies can't be certain when they put an application in, if they win, or they lose, then where are we going to be in 5 years' time looking to replace yet more national infrastructure?
Thank you all very much indeed.